I am Daniel Lucas, and welcome to Book 101 Review. Book 101 Review is all about the books that I read for the last 40 years, and today I have my special guest. He is my feature author of the month. He is award-winning author and best-selling author too, no other than Mr. Sebastien de Castell.
Hi, Daniel. Thanks for having me.
Welcome back, Mr. Sebastien, and can you please introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm a Canadian and British fantasy novelist. My first series was a swashbuckling fantasy series called The Greatcoats, which began with Traitor's Blade and then went through 4 books in that quartet. Which was a bit like, I think at the time we used to call it Three Musketeers meets Game of Thrones. And then other people know me through the Spellslinger series, which is a young adult magical fantasy adventure series, which spanned 8 books and has been translated into, I think, 15 languages or 13 languages. And in total, I think my book's been published in 15 or 16 languages around the world. And then that spun off into the Archaeology series, and I recently had a new series that's a bit more dark, irreverent fantasy called The Malevolent Seven that came out. So most of my work tends to span fantasy. I often lean towards sort of very swashbuckling sorts of characters and themes about friendship and the redemptive power of friendship and the struggle of idealism in a ever more cynical types of fantasy worlds that in that sense often reflect our own.
What inspired you to become an author?
Well, inspiration's an odd word for it in a way, in my case. And I think because, the natural state of human beings is inertia. We find something that works for us and then we'll tend to stay in that, along that course until something shifts it. In my case, although I'd always wanted to be a writer, like so many people, I was always very clear that, a writer is someone who writes, not someone who talks about wanting to write. But when I was, I guess I was around 27, I was a full-time musician working in a traveling rock band, making something like $250 a week, and being sued by the bass player for control of the band. We just, it was a stressful time and a strange time. He and I became friends again later on, but suddenly I was getting lawyers' letters and looking at my career, which was already nothing to write home about, slipping away into nothingness. And so I did what I always do when life becomes overwhelming, which is I went to the library. And I love libraries. I've always loved libraries. I married a librarian because they are places where anyone can go and reach for any type of knowledge or any type of story without any form of judgment from anyone else. Librarians are wonderful in that sense. Although we often think they're very judgmental about people being too noisy, they're not judgmental people by nature, and they believe in this idea that people should be allowed to search for knowledge wherever they want. And so I wandered around the library and ended up finding a box of cassette tapes in one of the shelves that was called Let's Write a Mystery by a guy named Ralph McInerney. And these were cassette tapes. And even though this was quite a while ago, I still had to go and find an actual cassette player so that I could listen to these things. And it turned out to be a kind of a 24 cassette tape course on writing a novel in which the instructor, Ralph McInerney, would basically talk you through the process of writing a manuscript while he was writing his own manuscript. And the most interesting thing about this box of book tapes was that in the box, he included the first draft of the manuscript that he was writing while you were taking this sort of course alongside him. And I think part of the appeal to me was that when I was a kid, I remember seeing an old, not that popular Walt Disney movie called Bedknobs and Broomsticks. which was a bit of a take on another sort of old Disney film. But in this one, the main character is this woman who has been taking magic lessons by correspondence, which, you're through the story, you mostly assume that it's, a scam, that you can't really learn magic through correspondence courses. But of course, it ends up all working and becoming magical. And so I was kind of drawn to that sort of notion of this strange box of book tapes promising to teach me how to be a novelist. And so I listened to the tapes, and every time you turned over the tape, Ralph McInerney would say in his sort of 1960s science professor voice, "Have you written your pages today? You've got to write those pages just like I am." And so I swear you could hear him typing away in the background. And it was interesting because I read the manuscript that he includes inside this box of tapes teaching you how to write a mystery. And it was the worst piece of crap I'd ever read in my life, which was wonderful. It was absolutely wonderful because the thing is, Ralph McInerney was a very renowned mystery writer. He wrote the Father Dowling mysteries and things like that. I think one of his series might have become a TV show. He was a professor at Notre Dame University. So this was someone who was very skilled, and yet he was willing to show everyone who was listening to his course on cassette tapes, to show them how rough something can actually look, even in the hands of an accomplished master. And so that kind of prompted me to write my first book, which was equally terrible, but kind of changed my life because it just changed the way I looked at the world. I always tell people, writing your first novel, you never need to worry about whether it's going to sell or whether anyone's going to like it, because the reason why you do it is the same reason you might train to run your first marathon. It's not because you expect to win. It's because you want to change your body into a body that can run a marathon, which itself is a pretty miraculous thing to do. And in the course of writing a novel, it's because you want to change your brain into a brain that can actually write novels. And when you do that, I found for me that it just expanded my ability to think through big, complicated problems in a permanent way. And that led to me being promoted in jobs that had nothing to do with writing, and having this wonderful career working at Vancouver Film School, which is a great entertainment school, and all of these amazing things. And so it wouldn't have mattered if I'd ever sold a novel. But years later, I, at the last moment, decided to jump into what's called the 3-day novel writing contest, which happens every year. It's been going on for, I think, 45 years or something. Anyone can do it. And it happens, I think, in the Labor Day weekend. And in 3 days, you try to write a novel. Now, most people just try to write, maybe 10, 15,000 words, and they often have outlines. I had nothing. I literally signed up the last possible minute, went to bed that night. Most people start at midnight. I just went to sleep, got up at 7 the next morning, wasn't even sure what story I was going to write. And then something kind of triggered in me from that point, where in the course of those 3 days, I wrote 44,000 words. I slept better than I usually sleep. And I went for long runs. I even had a music gig where I had to sing at a wedding. And at the end of that, I had this 44,000 word draft of a novel that at the time was called Three of Traitors. But years later, when I decided to revise it, expand it, and submit it, became Traitor's Blade, which was my debut novel and launched my career as a fantasy author.
Thank you for your sharing your talents to the world, Mr. Sebastien. So, what challenges have you faced in your writing career?
Almost all of my challenges, and I think this is true for a lot of writers, are internally created. So they are, I won't mince words with you or your listeners, Daniel. Writing novels for a living is difficult. It's difficult because you are trying to write, these books that will mean something to other people. And the question of how to do that isn't something you answer once and then you know the answer forever. You often feel that way as a writer. You'll go, wow, I figured this out. I finally figured out. Now I found my process. I know how to do this. But of course, it doesn't last. You have to keep discovering over and over something inside yourself that will let you write a story that other people will want to read. So it's a difficult job in that sense. So for me, I'm often, I wrestle continuously with writer's block. Um, I'm not sure how to go forward, and I will procrastinate and wrestle with things. And then on the business side, of course, it's a tricky business. It's not nearly so kind of venal or dying or cruel as people seem to say quite often. That isn't to say that the people who've had terrible experiences aren't correct. Those experiences happen, and probably happen all too often, as I have seen in every other field I've ever worked in. I've yet to see a field where I didn't find that there was, unfairness and sometimes systematic injustice and things like that. But publishing generally is mostly made up with people struggling to figure out how to do exactly what the writer's doing, which is put out books that people will enjoy. And but it can be but that itself can be difficult, because you just don't know from day to day where you are in your career, and are you on an upswing or a downswing? Because it's always one or the other. There's not really a point of stability. And so, depending on how you as an individual handle that, there's two ways you can do it. You can either be well, actually, there's an infinite number of ways, but the two ways a lot of people do it. Some writers I know just kind of ignore it. They go, I don't even look at my royalty statements. I just write my books and hope. And then other people become obsessed with their numbers and looking at their Goodreads scores and, reading their 1-star reviews or whatever else. And I find neither of those things works very well. But finding the perfect balance where you are engaged and taking charge of your career as a novelist, as someone who is an artisan earning a living from their work, without becoming obsessed with what other people are saying or what's going on in the industry, or, oh my goodness, this debut author is now like selling more copies of their books than I am, or all those kind of weird feelings, or, oh no, people are saying online that they now hate this kind of trope, or they're sick of this type of genre, and oh, everything now must be romantasy, or all of those kind of things. They can really infect your life. So the challenges for me are general. If I were to sum it up, is writing the truest, best literary work I can within a space where there are all of these different business and social forces constantly kind of coming at you.
Very well said, Mr. Sebastian. So, what authors or books have influenced your writing?
Well, I think as with a lot of authors, my writing gets influenced by different authors, depending on what day of the week it is, and depending on what someone's written. Certainly, the early authors that affected me, and I think influenced my style, were authors like Keith Taylor, who wrote the book and the series called Bard. Keith is an Australian author and a really lovely person, and he wrote these wonderful adventure novels about a traveling musician who swings a sword, tells stories, and goes on adventures. Which was basically, when I read it, I decided that's what I wanted my career to be, even though there were no job postings for bards at the time. But also a couple of great Canadian authors, Charles Delain, who wrote urban fantasy back before it was werewolves and sexy vampires, but when it was really about the magic of cities intersecting with, because when we think of magic, we often sort of think of the wilderness and sort of earlier times, but he and others kind of pioneered this notion of exploring the magic inside of cities, as well as, of course, Guy Gabriel Kay, Canadian legend, who writes amazing books. But probably the most influential on my writing, especially when I started out, was Stephen Brust, who wrote the Vlad, and still writes the Vlad Taltos novels, the first of which was called Jared, which was the first fantasy novel I'd read other than Nine Princes in Amber from Roger Zelazny, the great grandmaster of 70s and 80s science fiction and fantasy. But Stephen Bruce's writing managed to write in a style that was fantasy but still felt contemporary. It wasn't full of these and thous and people talking in that sort of faux emulation of what we imagine, knights would talk like in some fictional court, but rather the language of people on the street. And so as a narrator, I found Vlad Taltos wonderful. And so that influenced some of my style as well. But my dialogue is heavily influenced by, for example, the TV writer Aaron Sorkin, who wrote The West Wing, who I think is one of the best dialogue writers of all time, along with William Goldman, who wrote All the President's Men and Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and also wrote The Princess Bride, which of course is a sort of wonderful swashbuckling homage. So there's a lot of those influences, but as when I'm writing now, often I'll be influenced by writers who might be outside my genre and outside my my style. Louise Ehrlich, I think her book The Roundhouse I found remarkable, as well as Kate Quinn, who wrote the Alice Network, which is set. It's about, I think, set between World War I and World War II, or after World War II, but it's dealing with women spies during that period of time. So nothing that's in my realm of what I write about, and yet you just constantly find yourself picking up little tidbits and skills and approaches from those other writers. And I think this is something that I encourage a lot of other writers. Let's say if you're a fantasy writer, if you want to be a fantasy writer, for example, the first thing you're probably going to want to do is read lots of fantasy novels and find what you love, and then write something that you really love within that space. And because you're drawing from all those other fantasy influences, you're going to have an easier time kind of speaking the language of and the tropes of and the styles of that field. But after you've written a few books, you find yourself hitting a wall where you can't keep drawing on the same influences. So you have to read outside your genre. You have to kind of see what other people are doing, because every genre does something better than other genres. And so the wider you reach, the more writers, the more different kinds of writers, the more you can kind of bring that into what you do, and just keep growing as a novelist.
Indeed, Mr. Sebastian. But before we go on, we want to shout out our listeners in Portugal. Thank you so much, Portugal, for listening to this podcast, because in Lisbon, I got 41% audience share, Porto Faro, Viero Braga, Santarém, and Coimbra. Thank you again, Portugal, for supporting this podcast, because this podcast is created to empower writers, authors all over the world, like Mr. Sebastien de Castell. So, Mr. Sebastian, how do you approach research for your books?
So I kind of try to do it as I need it. And that's entirely because I write fantasy. And so I'm not trying to kind of replicate a particular historical era, because, for example, let's say a lot of fantasy has a sort of a medieval flavor. I tend to write fantasy that's a little bit more what we would say in the period of the Renaissance, the early modern period. So things that would more closely align to the 16th, 17th century, maybe, or 15th century to some extent. But if you just go and emulate that, but then put different names on the places and whatever else, and then introduce fantasy features, for example, some element of magic or a different cultural tradition. For example, in the Greatcoats series, there's a very rich cultural tradition of trial by combat that's much more intricate and prevalent than was ever the case in our own world. Well, that's going to change the shape of how those cultures operate. And so if all you do is sort of take a particular historical place and time, and then you just kind of, I think N.K. Jemisin calls it filing off the serial numbers. In other words, just kind of changing names and terms in the map a little bit. But then introduce fantasy elements, it's not really going to make sense, right? A culture is the product of its people, its history, but also its science, its technology, its religion, all those other things. So once you bring those other things in, you have to create a world that's consistent around that, far more so than consistent around seeming like a particular historical period. And for just one example, my own case, for example, in the Greatcoats, because of this rich history of trial by combat, and because it's actually very difficult there to forge really good steel, the cost of a really amazing rapier blade, like a really well forged rapier blade, will be very high. Almost as high in a way as the cost of plate armor, which would probably not be made of the best steel in that fantasy world because it would be so expensive. And as a result, swords have a better fighting edge against armored opponents than they would necessarily in our world, right? And so that changes the dynamics of lots of other things. And so you have to follow that. So in terms of research, that means that for me, what I tend to do is I'm building my world around a set of ideas, a set of themes that I care about, that I think I can bring dramatically to life. And then I'll go, okay, what I need something that makes sense for this, either in terms of physics or chemistry or language wise. And that's when I do my research. So I try to bring my research in, one piece at a time when I need it, rather than being guided by the research. Now, I know other writers who love to be guided by the research. They will read, a dozen books on the Ottoman Empire and then write a fantasy world sort of around that. And I think that can work wonderfully as well. But for me, I want my world derived from the drama that I'm trying to write, and not my drama bounded by what's viable in the particular world that I've created.
Can you share a memorable moment from your writing career?
Well, certainly there's been a lot, ranging from, the first time I was in a hotel room in Toronto because my wife was at a library conference, and I was sending out query letters to try to get an agent. And she came in the hotel room and said, I was just at this dinner and I met the head of Penguin Canada, and his wife's starting a literary agency and he wants to see your manuscript. And I was saying, well, and she was quite excited. And I was like, well, that's, it's just somebody at dinner being polite. They're not going to care. But then they persisted. And then it ended up being that Heather Adams became my agent, and is still my friend even after she's retired. I couldn't have gotten a better agent as a starting writer. But there's other moments along the way. But I think one of the ones that always sticks with me was, it was before Spellslinger was going to be published. And when I first wrote Spellslinger, Kellen, who is this young man living in a society where magic means everything. It is the thing that makes the people of that country feel safe against the other countries around it. It is the measure of someone's merit within that society. His father and mother are renowned mages. His younger sister is the most talented mage of her generation. And he starts out the story about to take his mage's trials, only to find his magic has faded and has disappeared. And it goes a very different path from most of those kinds of stories, in which, the culmination is meant to be, but he finds his magic and it's better than everyone else's. I didn't want to do that because that didn't reflect my life as a teenager at all. I wanted it to be about someone who has to learn from other people a set of entirely different skills that don't have to do with magic, that allows him to survive and thrive in a world where, his opponents have spells to use against him. And similarly, I didn't want him to have, a traditional familiar. There's this propensity in a lot of fantasy where the the young sort of hero will have, or mage will have a familiar who just instantly adores them, will do anything they want, is basically like a kind of happy, willing servant. And I've never liked that image. And as a longtime owner or servant of cats, it's never resonated with me that any animal would think of a person that way. And so I created this sort of sidekick for Kellen that was that saw himself not as Kellen's familiar, but as his business partner. And so is constantly renegotiating their relationship and what Kellen has to do for him. And so that character was called Rikus. And when I wrote the first draft of the book, he was going to be a raccoon. And that's because I live in Vancouver, and frequently in our backyards, we'll get up in the morning or at night and see a raccoon or two in the backyard, just having a good time. And I remember this one time, we have a fountain in our backyard, and we have these, we have sort of a couple of outdoor chairs, and we had some cushions on it. And I went outside and saw this raccoon taking one of our cushions and repeatedly dipping it into the fountain and then using it as a loofah to scrub himself. And so I opened the door and I said, "Hey, that's not cool, man." And usually raccoons sort of run off, but this one kind of turned, looked at me, and then I swear rubbed his behind with the cushion and then tossed it and then sauntered away. And so that was my Rikus. But of course, when Spellslinger sold as an 8-book series, Guardians of the Galaxy had come out, and Rocket was such a terrific character. And even though Rocket insists he's not a raccoon, everyone sees as a raccoon. So when they were talking about selling the movie rights, the attorney, there was concern of, no director is going to want to try to recreate a talking raccoon character, because if it's not as good as James Gunn's version of Guardians of the Galaxy, like of Rocket Raccoon, then they're not going to be happy about that. And so you asked, about a memorable moment. So the memorable moment was this. I was on an island off the coast of British Columbia working on the third Greatcoats novel, which I had to interrupt to take a phone call that was, I think, 2 hours long, in which I was walking along this coastline with my agents in London, the CEO of the publishing house, I think, might have been in Australia. I was in Canada, and the lawyer was in Hollywood. And as the four of us, and these are some pretty important people, we're debating which kind of animal Rikus should be, with this extended debate of someone would say, well, what about a rat? Because, rats and magic. And then someone else saying, well, no, there's markets in Asia where they won't like that, which I'm still dubious as to how correct that is. But and then someone else saying, well, what if we make it a wolf? And I was like, well, it's not, a wolf that thinks he's the apex predator isn't funny, because wolves are tough. Like a raccoon that thinks he's the toughest animal in the animal kingdom, that's kind of funny. And so we were just debating all these different animals. And it was just the strangest conversation to be having with the CEO of a publishing house, 2 high-powered agents, and a Hollywood entertainment lawyer. But those are the kinds of strange things that happen when you're a novelist.
Definitely. So how do you balance writing with the other aspect of your life?
Well, I wouldn't say I balance it very well. It's an unusual sort of vocation because it doesn't shut off at convenient times. I think we all have had, partners or family members or friends who, work in sort of various kinds of jobs, and, when they come home and they're still focused on things going on at work, we'll often tell them like, hey, you're not really present. You need to leave work at the office. With writing, I find it very difficult to do that because it doesn't really stop. It's in the back of your head all the time, to the point where, for example, and lots of writers will describe this experience. Once you start writing novels, you of course develop a sense of structure. And when you're watching a movie or a television show, you are constantly aware of structural elements, and you're constantly aware of clues. like foreshadowing and things like that, because it's something you have to do yourself. And so the most frequent thing my wife will hear me say sometimes is it'll be 2 minutes into a TV show or a movie where I'll go, oh yeah, that guy's going to turn out to have stolen that from this other guy. And it'll just be because there's one shot that lingers on something too long. There's an old literary principle called Chekhov's gun, which is if you see a gun on the mantle in the first act, it has to be fired in the second act, because otherwise, why were you pointing it out? So it's very difficult to balance it out. Sometimes, most of the time, though, the balance just comes out of necessity, because I want to be present for my wife and friends and things like that. That's a constant struggle for me, is sort of finding that balance, because if I'm not getting my writing done, during the time where I'm supposed to be doing my writing, then that impetus is going to stay with me. And if I do get all my writing done, then my brain is in that mode, in that flow, and it doesn't want to leave it. So So I haven't found a good solution to it yet, but hopefully I'll find one soon.
Looking for that solution, Mr. Sebastian.
Yeah.
And before we go on, I'm inviting you to please do listen to my other podcast, Food 101, our fourth season with Chef Alessandro, one of the best executive chef and one of five-star hotel in downtown Toronto. So please do listen to our latest episode. We talk about our culinary courses, people. Food 101 basics. Volume 2 is principles, and volume 3 is more to come. More volumes to come. So please do purchase Food 101 culinary courses. So, Mr. Sebastian, what will be your advice for those aspiring writers out there?
My advice has been the same for a while now. When I first started, the advice was very similar to what a lot of writers will say, which is write the book you most want to read. But over the years, I've modified that with one adverb, which is write the book you most want to read boldly. And what I mean by that is, I think in the particular era that we're living right now, there is a constant sense of restraint that young and new writers, regardless of age, impose upon themselves. We are all so sophisticated and aware of media criticism of various forms. So, I sometimes use the example of Twilight, where, Twilight was one of the most successful young adult romantic fantasy series of all time. Countless people loved those books. They didn't necessarily appeal to me, but they weren't necessarily for me, but they were exceedingly popular. But the backlash against it was quite strong. And a lot of the backlash was things like, sparkly vampires. It was like they're, trying to make these vampires like super sexy and noble and all this stuff. And that bothered people. And so what'll happen is someone might love that kind of story. They might be drawn to writing something like a Twilight, but of course, their own ideas, their own world. But then they'll have that voice in their heads going, oh, people on Twitter, they really criticize this and this and this. And so what they'll do is, rather than expose themselves to that potential ridicule, they will restrain their own writing. They'll go, well, I want to seem sophisticated, so I won't make these vampires the way I want them to be, right? I won't make them beautiful and kind and, with this hint of darkness. I'm going to try to, fit them into what I think people won't criticize. And that is the most surefire way imaginable to write a book no one wants to read. And so I tell people, do it the other way around. If what you love is sparkly vampires, make them the sparkliest vampires imaginable. If what you love is grand, noble, very, classic dude heroes, write the most noble, most dude hero. It's much easier to pull things back in a final draft than it is to inject life and energy and passion into a very skillfully written but passionless draft. So write the book you most want to read boldly.
Very well said, Mr. Sebastian. And can you please invite our listeners to support all your books?
Sure. Yeah. My books are easy to find. They're in most bookstores and Amazon, and they're in audiobooks. And if you're, a French speaker, a lot of them are published in French, and some are published in Spanish, Italian, Hebrew, Russian, Ukrainian. So they're not all published in all languages, of course. My website is decastell.com, decastell.com. So if you're someone who's read a book and you want to get in touch with me, that's the best place to get in touch with me. I answer every email someone sends to me, as long as they don't claim to be a Nigerian prince offering me millions of dollars. And the books are all out there on audiobook as well, if that's your preferred form. So the Greatcoats is a great place to start if you like swashbuckling fantasy. If you're more into young adult fiction, then Spellslinger or the Argosy books that begin with Way of the Argosy. There's plenty to choose from. I think Play of Shadows, my most recent book, is my 16th novel. So yeah, you won't run out of stuff to read.
Yes, people, let's support Mr. Sebastien de Castell, because if you support him, more books to come. So, Mr. Sebastien, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Daniel.
More to come, people. See you soon.